All right, thank you everyone for attending this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and this week we're going to be talking about dynamic controls. But before I get to that, a couple housekeeping items. First, Xojo 2014 release 1.1 did come out today, so you can head on over to our website to download that if you haven't already. It has a handful of fixes. Probably the biggest one is a fix to building Mac apps on Windows. And there was an update for Windows regarding that OpenSSL heartbleed bug that kind of took the internet by storm last week. I am also in the process of planning upcoming webinars for May, June, and July. So if you have topic suggestions, by all means, now's the time to get them to me. You can just shoot me an email, paul@xojo.com. Shoot me a private message on the forum. Contact me on Twitter, @Xojo or @Lefevre. Lots of ways to find me. So if you get topic suggestions that you think would make a good webinar, by all means, let me know. And I am considering possible guest speakers for upcoming webinars. So if you think you have a skill or a topic or something you might like to talk about, by all means, get in touch with me. And I think that's all I have here for notes. So without further ado, we'll get started. Again, feel free to ask questions as I'm talking. I don't particularly think this webinar is going to take the full hour, so feel free to ask questions. So let's dive right in here. Xojo, open up a little desktop project. So dynamic controls. What are dynamic controls? Well, that's a way for you to add controls to your app as it's running at runtime. So they're not controls that necessarily are all placed on your layout at design time. They're added depending on the needs of your application. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, you're not going to probably need to do that super often. Again, it depends on the design of your application. But there are certain cases where it makes a lot of sense. If you have a tab-based UI, it's very common to allow the user to create new tabs and then you to add new controls within the tab. So that's one way that you might have dynamically created controls at runtime. Another way is just if you don't know how many UI elements you need on the screen, because what the app's going to do is based on some other information, maybe some information the user provides, or maybe a text file that has a structure defined that your interface will be based on. So there are two ways in desktop projects to add controls to your project dynamically at runtime. The first way is to use something called control sets. And the second way are to use container controls. So first we're going to take a look at control sets. So what is a control set? I'm just going to drag any old thing onto the window here. So we now have a control that's on a window. And if I look at the inspector and I go to the advanced tab here, you can see there's a section here called control set. And a control set essentially is a single control. And once you pick it a member of a control set, you can have multiple controls, but they'll all share the same event handlers. That's one thing a control set gives you. The other thing the control set gives you is that you can create new instances of the control set at runtime. So creating a control set is pretty easy. You just come to the little drop down here and you pick new control set. And it now becomes a member and it has the default index of 0. Each item in the control set gets an increasing index. So if I were to duplicate this, I now have 2 buttons on here, both of which are in the same control set, which you can also see here on the navigator. They're in the members tree and they're listed with their index right next to them. Now, if I want to add an event handler, I can pick the event handler just as I normally would, and it'll show up in the event handler as it normally would. But you'll notice that it has an additional parameter here that's not typically available, which is the index. And that tells you which of the controls was actually clicked. And the index corresponds with the property you saw in the inspector for the control. So that's how you can add control sets to your window layouts. Now, control sets are pretty useful in general, even if you don't intend to dynamically add your controls at runtime. One common use for control sets is with labels. Often when you're creating a window layout, you're probably going to have a lot of labels all over the place. And it can start to make the navigator get a bit cluttered having a bunch of labels that you really don't care about their names or anything because they're just text on the window layout to help the user out. So one thing you can do is create a label control set. And then rather than drag a new label onto the window each time, you can just duplicate it and change its property. So it'll have different properties and everything and different text or whatnot, but it'll just show up in the navigator the one time. If you close the little members part. So that can be and that's something you see people do from time to time to help make things a little neater. Now I'm going to open up a project here that makes use of a control set to dynamically create some questions for a quiz. So what I've done here is I have a little text file. Nothing fancy, kind of a lame format actually, but it's easy to read. And this is a list of questions, either multiple choice or true false. And if they're multiple choice, they start with MCP for multiple choice problem. And I have the question listed there after the colon, and then multiple choice answers, and then what the available answers are, and then what the correct answer would be. So I have 3 in this file here, 2 multiple choice problems and 1 true or false problem. So what I'm going to do is create, well, not necessarily create, I'm going to show you a project because you know me, I don't like to create code on the fly. Too many things go wrong. So we're going to open up this project here that shows you how you can dynamically create a user interface using that text file containing the questions. So the layout's pretty simple. This is, of course, just an example, so it's not super slick in many ways, but there's not a lot of controls on the main window. I just have a big label that I've added here. This is not part of a control set. This is just going to be used to display the question that we read from the file. It doesn't change other than the text, so it doesn't really need to be part of the control set. The next button also is not part of the control set. This just moves us to whatever the next question is that was in the file. But the button that's over here and off the side of the window is in the control set, or is a control set. And there's only one here. And I've named the button answer button. So that's the name of the control set. And I've created just a single one. And what we're going to do is when the file is loaded, we're going to create the buttons that are needed for the particular question. So the multiple choice question can have really any number of buttons, but the true or false typically is always just going to have 2 buttons, a true or a false button. So that's how that's going to work. So I've put this one button off to the side because this is a fairly common pattern you use when you're dealing with control sets and you want to create controls at runtime. Is you always have to have an actual control set somewhere on the window. Now, this is actually off the window, but it still counts as being available. So because the way this design is going to work, when the file's read in, it's going to create new buttons for whatever the questions are. And it's not going to change this button. This button's going to stay off to the side and hidden because it's used as the template for creating the new buttons. And then when we move to the next question, we remove the buttons because those are no longer valid. They're not needed because they're not valid for the next question. So we remove all the new buttons we created, but we do not remove this essentially master or template button because if we did end up removing it, we wouldn't be able to create new ones. So that's why this one is kind of here off to the side and try not to worry about it. So looking here at the load quiz method, it's a little bit of file I/O here at the beginning, just getting the text file, opening it up with input streams, which I talked about in a previous webinar. And I'm just doing some simple string manipulation. I'm splitting the file on the colon. Nothing fancy here. Again, if I were designing this, I probably wouldn't use a text file formatted in this way. But again, it depends on the use case. That sort of format of a text file might be easy for, say, a teacher to edit. rather than using XML or JSON or something like that. So you have to think about what makes sense. If we hit the little double sign here that I've used to indicate a new problem, we create a new problem, and this is a class down here in the navigator, has a few properties. And we add the problem to our array of problems, so we have them all in memory and can move through them. And then if we have a multiple choice problem, we set the problem type on the class, and we set the question to whatever the value is. And if it's a multiple choice answer, same thing, we save the answers. True false problem, we set the type, save the question. And then if it's an answer, we save the appropriate answer depending on the type of the problem. So this essentially, all this code is doing is populating our problem structure, our problem class in the array. It's creating an array of problem classes, which is our data structure that the app runs against. One nice thing about this, and this is just a general design thing, is that if it turned out I wanted to use a different file format, XML or JSON or something like that, my problem class probably wouldn't need to change at all. The only code I would need to change is this code that's processing the file and then populating the problem class. The rest of the code, because it works only off of the problem class itself, wouldn't care how the file got loaded. So just a general one design idea you can think about when you're creating your apps. So after the file's been processed and the data structures are set up, it calls the create UI method here. And this just makes sure that we actually have some problems to process. And then it gets whatever the current one happens to be and starts to create the buttons. And the big lines of code that actually create the buttons are just in this little for loop right here. This creates the buttons for the multiple choice problems. And essentially it's just going through all the multiple choice answers that were loaded from the file. They were processed in the file processing routine, and they were just comma separated. So there's just one in the array for each item. And this line here, this little simple looking line, dim B as new answer button, is creating a new button dynamically at runtime that is added to the window. Now this works because answer button is a control set. If answer button was not a control set, this line wouldn't do anything. You wouldn't get a new button on your window. So that's kind of the combination of the two steps. The fact that this is a control set allows this line of code to actually add the button to the audio. Sorry, I'm reading a thing here and it says audio was lost and now it's back. Oh, seems like a lot of people had some audio breakup. Do I need to repeat anything before I continue much further? What would be the last thing that came through clearly? All right, well, I'll move along. If people ended up missing something I said, feel free to ask a question. I can clarify it. I don't know why the audio would mess up, but we do have a pretty big windstorm blowing through here that could be affecting weird things like that. All right, so where was I? So the new answer button is what's creating the line of code. It is creating the new button on the window because it is part of a control set. And once you have this, you can change the properties just like you can anything else. So I'm making the new button visible because remember the master one or the template one that we've hidden off to the left, I've set to be invisible. And because this would be essentially a copy of it, it would by default be invisible. So I want to immediately make it visible. And I want to set its left position. Because if I don't, it'll just appear at the same location as our master one, which is off of the window and won't do us a heck of a lot of good. And because we're going to have multiple buttons, we want them to kind of be lined up. So we have to adjust the left position as we go through the loop. And then the last thing I do is set the caption of the button to be the multiple choice answer that we're working through. So this is what processes the creation of the buttons for a multiple choice question. And the last thing I'm doing here is I'm storing the button count. And this is important because I'm removing the buttons later. And you don't have access to how many controls are in the control set easily in Xojo. There's not like a simple method you can count that'll say give me the number of controls in this control set. You can't use ubound for that because control sets are not arrays. And you can kind of scan the entire window and check all the controls on the window and do a count that way. But that might be a bit more work than you want to do. So I'm just storing the count since I happen to know what it is anyway. And then I'll use this count later to remove the buttons before the next problem recreates new ones. If I weren't removing the buttons, you'd end up with, a whole bunch of buttons appearing all over your window, which wouldn't exactly be what you'd want. True or false works pretty much the same way. There's no for loop to create two buttons, to create the buttons, because there's always two buttons. So we just create the two buttons. So I'm just going to run this here before we look at any other code. So you can see we now have the initial question here that matches what is in the text file. And we can pick a wrong answer and a right answer. Not terribly useful at the moment because it's just letting me pick things, but I can pick next and it'll move on to the next question. And again, I can pick the answers, see whether they're correct or not. And then I can move on to the true false question and pick the answers. And then when I hit the last question, it just says the quiz is complete. Now there could be any number of questions. I can keep adding to this list, and this particular app design will just keep asking the questions because they'll have been in the array that the file created as it was processed. And each time it goes through, it'll create the buttons that are necessary. Going back to, I want to open up the event handler. The event handler for the button is actually checking to see which type of question we're dealing with, if it's multiple choice or true or false. And then it's checking to see if the button that was clicked matches what the correct answer is so that it can display whether it's right or wrong. And the only other super interesting code on here is the next button code. And this is increasing the array index for our problems. And when it reaches the end, it says quiz complete. And if it hasn't reached the end, it removes all the current buttons. And notice the removal is happening in reverse order. So we start at the top and we go our way down. And this is very important. You cannot start at the bottom and work your way up because the upper bound will change. This is a general problem with deleting rows from list boxes and removing things from arrays. And the same kind of issue applies here. You want to delete from the end of the list to the beginning. And after the previous buttons that we've created are gone, we can then recreate the UI for whatever the current question is. And current problem index and some of these other things are properties on this particular window. So we have current problem index here. Button count is the number of buttons I mentioned earlier that I'm retaining. And problems is our array of problems that the file processed and populated for us. So that's pretty much all you see here in this particular code that's creating this dynamic user interface. The only thing to point out is the problem class here doesn't actually have any code on it. It just has the properties that are listed here for storing the information that I wanted for the various problems that are displayed. And I am using an enumeration to track the type of the problem. So that's how you do this sort of thing using a control set. Now, if there are no questions on that, we're going to look at the same sort of example, but one that is using a container control. And Nathan is asking how the problems array is defined, so I will just show that here in the inspector. The problems is defined as an array, so it has the two parentheses after it, and its data type is the problem class that we have down here. All right, so let me open up a version of this that is using container controls. This looks exactly the same here. The load quiz code, again, is exactly the same. The problem class is exactly the same, no changes in there. What is different, however, is there's a new thing down here called answer button. This is a container control. All it has in it is a single button. And I'll expand this out here. There's a couple properties, and the button has one action event. So the button has a computed property here whose only the set method is implemented, and this just is used to set the value of the caption of the button. And there's also a Boolean property on here that is set to true if this particular button is the correct answer. Now, it's a slightly different design technique than we used in the control set example, whereas the buttons themselves didn't really know if they were the right answer or not. We had code in the action event that kind of checked that each time a button was clicked. But with this design, a button knows if it's the correct answer. I kind of like this design a little bit better. It's a little more object-oriented, a little better encapsulation. But it's different, something to kind of get your head wrapped around. So that's what this property is for. And then the action event of the button, because the button knows if it's the correct answer or not, is very simple. It just has to say, hey, am I the correct answer? And say correct. So that's what our container control is. Again, it's very simple container control. Now the create UI method is a bit different, not a lot different, but a bit different than the control set one. Set of stuff here at the top is the same. But when you get to the for loop, though, this is where it differs a little bit. The first thing you can see is it still have the same, what looks like the same exact line of code. Dim B is new answer button. And that's because I named our container answer button. It's no longer an actual button that's on the window. It's a container control that's in your project. So I'm creating a new instance of this. I'm calling our button caption computed property to set the caption to one of the multiple choice answers. And then here, I check if the current answer that we're processing is actually the correct answer. Then I also set the button to say, hey, button, congratulations, you are the correct answer. Otherwise, it'll have its default of false, which means sorry, button, but you're the wrong answer. I again am storing the buttons in the array. And the new line of code here, to add this container control to the window, I call the embed within method. And this embeds the container B into self, the window, at the specified left and top coordinates. And again, the math calculation here just makes sure the buttons appear side by side, and then I have badly hard-coded the height in here as an integer. Don't do that in your apps. And then I store the button count. And the same technique is in the true false section. You create the new container, set its properties, and embed it at the positions we want. So when I run this, you'll see the exact same behavior. I can click on the buttons. Earth knew it was the wrong answer. Jupiter knows it's the correct answer. The next takes me to the next item in the problem array, where I can pick what ought to be the correct answer, and I can move through like that. So it works exactly the same. Now, personally, I most of the time prefer this container control method. Not only do I find it a little cleaner from an object-oriented standpoint, but it does have a benefit I'm not taking advantage of in this example, that you can have multiple controls in the container control. So if this button had an associated label with it or some other control, you can kind of reuse that a lot cleaner than having multiple control sets that you had to all manage together. Another benefit of using this container control method is that the technique applies pretty much directly to a web app, which is what we'll look at next. Nathan is asking if I can explain the new if statement that I'm using, and I just want to find reference to that. Here it is right here. So right down here on this line of code, I have what am I doing? That's the load quiz method. So I'm setting if this is the correct true or false answer, and I'm using the new if operator that was added in 2014 R1. And this essentially works the same as writing out, I'll write this out in long form. Let me move my wires out of the way so I can type. And of course, this probably could be written a variety of ways as well. I probably could have just written it as, oh no, it's a string value, so it might not have worked. But anyway, the above if statement is essentially the same, it's exactly the same as this code here. And I'm just checking, this is the first condition that I'm checking, and if that evaluates to true, actually I got to type it right, this should be in quotes. Then we return true, and since we're returning the value, it gets assigned back to here. And if this is not true, use the second parameter, which is false, and we're returning the value back here. These return values can be any data type, they just have to match the data type you're assigning to. In this case, all of these things are Boolean, but that's not a requirement. Yes, and as Jeremy points out, this could be written in the other way. This is what I was also thinking, and I didn't type it right. I don't like writing stuff like this, though, but this certainly works as well. So you could also have written that above thing in this manner, which can be confusing to people, so I don't often tend to write this, but this, because it is an expression, gets evaluated, and if this gets evaluated to an answer, so this would be evaluated, if this gets evaluated to true, then the value true gets assigned here. If this gets evaluated to false, it gets assigned here. So 3 different ways you could write that. That's the beauty of programming. There's always multiple ways to do just about everything. So let's open up our web container example. All right, so this is a web project that pretty much is going to look exactly like our container control project that we just had. Now, most of the methods, properties are pretty much the same. Load quiz, as you've seen before, is always the same. Our properties haven't changed. The problem class itself hasn't changed. Answer button is a web container, defined pretty much exactly the same way as the container control in the desktop project. Actually, I think it is exactly the same way. Yep. And the create UI method, again, works exactly the same as the one in the desktop project, with only one slight difference, which is the embed within method requires the width and height parameters. Those are optional on the desktop method call. Go figure. I don't know why the difference. But that was the only code change that I had to make. And when I run this, you'll see the same, pretty much same looking app. Works exactly the same as the desktop one because it's using the same technique. So that is a great advantage of using the container controls for this sort of thing, because you can use your same design between a desktop and a web application. And yeah, I mean, there's literally no other difference here that I can think of. When I created this, I just created a new web project, copied in my problem class, which was exactly the same, created a new web container, and then duplicated its design that I had in the desktop project, copied over all my properties, copied over the code for load quiz, copied over the create UI code, and tweaked it ever so slightly. So that was a nice little quick thing to build that didn't require any changes going over to the website. Control sets are available on web projects, but they cannot be used to create controls at runtime. So if I do add a control here, there's still the control set option here, and I can add it, and then I can have multiple controls that are in the control set. And if I add an event handler, they all share the event handler with the index, the same the same way that it works on a desktop application. But the ability to create a new control using the new technique that I showed you in the desktop control set example does not work with web applications. So if you need to add your controls at runtime in a web application, container control is the strategy you're going to want to use. All right, so a couple other quick examples here. Obviously, my little Xojo, as I was calling it, Xojo apps are not included with Xojo just yet. I don't know that they're perhaps useful enough to include, but great software update, strange. But these examples here that I will open up for sliders are included with Xojo. And this little app is the simple slider game, little slider puzzle. You click and it moves the pieces around and you got to get them in numerical order. And it has different things you can click, and the tiles themselves are created dynamically at runtime because they are part of a control set. And you can see here, there's just a single control on the layout that is part of a control set. And then at runtime, I haven't looked at this code in a bit, but I think it's this method here. In between all kinds of other code to calculate grid sizes and positioning and whatnot, there is the same little simple line of code. Create a new slider tile that creates a new tile at runtime. So you can certainly take a look at this example for something that's a little bit more robust to see how control sets can be used. And for a companion one, there's also a web version of this project that uses container controls. So you can kind of compare and contrast the two techniques again to see how they work. And this one, same sort of general layout on the web page, but there is a container that is part of the project that has the item to click. And if I go back to the method, this is creating the new container at runtime and adding it to the web page at the appropriate positions and whatnot. And that works essentially the same way. All right. So those are two other examples that you can look at to get a feel for how you would use control sets and containers and how to compare and contrast. Like I had mentioned, generally I probably would lean towards preferring to use a container control, but there are certainly cases where control sets are easier to work with. All right, I got one question here from Nathan. The first example I showed using a problem class to store stuff in. What's the advantage of using a class rather than a multi-dimensional array? And he acknowledges that it is a newbie question. And that's fine. Yes, it is a bit of a newbie question. What are the advantages of using a class in an array rather than a multi-dimensional array? The advantages are everything. They're having modern data structures that define the problem set and are self-documented are just much, much better, easier to debug, easier to understand. If I had a multi-dimensional array that had, all these different data types, I'd have to keep everything in sync. I'd have to remember which things went where. It just quickly becomes complicated and messy, which is why pretty much any programming language you're going to work with today is object-oriented to try and make these problems easier to model and build. So certainly a multi-dimensional array would probably work fine, but I wouldn't want to be the one trying to wrap my head around all that. When you're dealing with, when you're designing your stuff in Xojo, by all means, classes are the way to go to create your data structures. You can have multiple properties of different types. You can easily throw the class in an array. It's the way to go. You don't want to use structures. You don't want to really go down the multi-dimensional array path just because that might be what you've used in the past. You want to take a look at a class first. All right, that's the end of what I have here. I'm just checking my time. Yeah, like I said, didn't quite take as long as I had expected. If there are other questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. As I typically do, I want to remind people, as I did at the beginning, new version of Xojo today, you can grab. Upcoming webinars are listed here. They're only listed through the end of this month of April. Like I said, I'm working on planning the webinars for May, June, and July. So again, if you have suggestions, paul@xojo.com, let me know them. I've got a few, I've got a lot on my list right now. I'm mostly working on scheduling how I want them to flow and the dates and whatnot. But I still have a few open slots, so if people have suggestions and think it might make a good webinar, I'd love to hear it. I have a very long document. I keep track of all people's suggestions. And of course, I want to remind everyone, take advantage of the Xojo forum. Great place to ask questions of your fellow Xojo developers and to answer questions for your fellow Xojo developers. And let's see here. I got one more question from Nathan. Any chance we might be doing training session on classes in the future? Well, I do have coming up, although this won't cover classes just yet, but on April 29th, so it's a couple weeks, the Introduction to Programming class is going to be starting at the beginning. And I expect I'll be doing kind of a series of this, one a month, to kind of work through the beginning of starting programming, getting up through classes and more advanced stuff. So classes probably wouldn't be until maybe the second or third one of these, guessing. I haven't planned out the full schedule yet, but that would be the ones to stay on top of, is the Introduction to Programming series that probably will continue throughout the year. All right, I don't see any further questions. So I want to thank everyone for attending this week's webinar. This will be available on YouTube as all the other ones. And I will point out that website right here, youtube.com/GoXojo. You can always find all the webinars, including the latest uploads, and you can actually subscribe if you've got a YouTube account here, and I think get yourself set up so you get notified when new ones are uploaded. The webinars are the files are all processed today. The uploads usually happen a day or so later, so I would probably expect this webinar and most webinars to be uploaded usually around Thursday of the week of the webinar. All right, I want to thank everyone for attending this week's webinar and have a great rest of your day.